The town of Lier, Belgium, in November 1991, was wrapped in the quiet rhythm of early evening. Streets lined with brick houses glowed under the fading sunlight, and children's laughter echoed from schoolyards as the last of the day's activities wound down. Among them walked 15-year-old Katrien De Cuyper, a girl whose ordinary life would soon be interrupted by an event that would shatter her family and grip an entire community in fear. Katrien's day had started like any other. She woke to the familiar sounds of her home, the hum of the radiator, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant chatter of her parents preparing for the day. Breakfast was routine, a slice of bread with jam, a cup of milk, small talk with her mother about school assignments, and reminders to be careful on the streets. Her life was ordinary, predictable, and safe, a life that offered her the comfort of routine and the warmth of family love. Walking to school, she greeted neighbors and friends with her signature smile. Her school bag was light but orderly, filled with books and notebooks, each one reflecting her dedication to her studies and her dreams for the future. Katrien was an intelligent, curious, and lively young girl. Teachers would later describe her as diligent and observant, classmates as kind and friendly, and neighbors as respectful and polite. There was nothing in her daily routine to suggest that danger loomed so close, nothing to hint that this November day would become a turning point in her life and in the town's history. After classes ended, she lingered briefly with friends near the schoolyard. Conversations were light, filled with laughter and the innocent chatter of teenagers discussing homework, favorite songs, and weekend plans. She walked a short distance to the corner shop, buying a small treat, greeting the shopkeeper, who knew her by name. Then, with a wave, she continued along her usual route toward home. Eyewitness accounts later painted fragments of her journey. A neighbor saw her walking past the park, her hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. Another witness, returning from work, noticed a figure on the bicycle path, a girl matching Katrien's description, moving steadily along the familiar streets. Yet these glimpses were brief, fleeting, almost ephemeral, as though the town itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the unknown. The ordinary comfort of her routine was shattered in a matter of moments. Somewhere between the shop, the park, and her home, Katrien disappeared. There was no struggle, no sound of commotion, no indication that anyone had approached her. It was as if she had simply vanished from the familiar streets she knew so well. The small town, usually safe and predictable, suddenly became a labyrinth of fear, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. Her parents first sensed that something was wrong when the evening hours passed with no sign of Katrien. They called her friends, retraced the routes she might have taken, checked with neighbors, but there was no answer, no sighting, no hint of her whereabouts. The ordinary lights of her home, once warm and welcoming, seemed to flicker in uncertainty as the fear of the unknown settled over the family. Police were alerted immediately. Officers arrived at the house, taking statements, piecing together a timeline of her last known movements, speaking with friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen her. Canine units were deployed, and search parties combed the nearby streets, parks, and alleyways. Every corner, every pathway, every familiar nook and cranny was examined, yet Katrien's trail remained frustratingly elusive. Hours turned into a night that felt endless. The town that had been so familiar, so safe, now seemed alien and unwelcoming. Windows remained lit, shadows stretched across the streets, and the community awoke to the realization that a young girl had vanished without a trace. Flyers were printed, photos distributed, and television announcements broadcast her disappearance to a wider audience. The media quickly picked up the story, amplifying both hope and anxiety. Reports began to surface possible sightings, unconfirmed leads, and fragmented accounts of a girl matching Katrien's description. A man on a bicycle, a shadow near the park gate, a fleeting figure seen through a shop window, all were investigated, yet none led to answers. Each tip, while hopeful, also carried the weight of uncertainty, the frustration of chasing shadows that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Neighbors and friends banded together, volunteers organized search parties, retraced familiar routes, and kept watch over streets that now held a sinister tension. The community's worry was palpable, an almost tangible presence that hung over Lier like a fog. Every passing hour without news of Katrien intensified the fear, deepened the mystery, and solidified the reality that this disappearance was not a fleeting incident. It was a crisis. Questions multiplied endlessly. Who had taken Katrien De Cuyper? Was she lost, kidnapped, or harmed? What had happened in the quiet streets she walked every day? The ordinary, predictable life that had defined her existence was now consumed by speculation, fear, and grief. Her disappearance was not only a personal tragedy for her family, but a shock to the social fabric of the town. Throughout that first night, and in the days that followed, the search for Katrien became increasingly complex. Witnesses were interviewed multiple times, statements compared, and potential leads examined with painstaking attention to detail. Every discarded clue, every unverified tip, every fragment of information was catalogued and analyzed. Yet the young girl remained missing. The emotional impact on her family was profound. Her parents oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the possibility that she might still be found, while confronting the harsh reality that something terrible could have occurred. Friends, neighbors, and the broader community shared in their anxiety, holding vigils, distributing information, and remaining vigilant for any sign of the missing teenager. The story of Katrien De Cuyper's disappearance would not end with that night. It marked the beginning of a decades-long investigation, a tale of mystery, grief, and relentless pursuit of answers. The quiet town of Lier had been forever changed, its ordinary streets now etched into the narrative of a case that would remain unresolved for years to come. Each shadow, each alley, each familiar pathway became a reminder of the uncertainty and urgency surrounding her disappearance. Before the chilling night of November 1991, Katrien De Cuyper's life had been ordinary in all the ways that mattered. She was a bright, lively 15-year-old girl, full of curiosity and warmth, living in the close-knit Belgian town of Lier. Her early mornings began with the comforting hum of her family's home, the soft aroma of breakfast, the chatter of parents preparing for their day, and the familiar creak of wooden floors underfoot. Life had a rhythm, a routine, a sense of safety that made the ordinary extraordinary. Katrien's family was the cornerstone of her life. Her parents, devoted and attentive, nurtured her with care and guidance. They instilled in her values of kindness, responsibility, and curiosity, while giving her the freedom to explore her world with confidence. Though loving, they remained vigilant, encouraging Katrien to maintain routines and habits that ensured her safety and well-being. The bond between Katrien and her family was strong. She trusted them deeply, and their home was her sanctuary, a place of laughter, warmth, and stability. School life was another pillar of Katrien's identity. She was an attentive student, excelling in subjects that required focus and creativity alike. Teachers remembered her as diligent, inquisitive, and polite, always raising thoughtful questions and helping classmates when they struggled. Katrien had a natural charm that made her well-liked among peers. Friends described her as compassionate and reliable, someone who could brighten a room with a smile or a comforting word. Her social circle, while not vast, was close-knit, bound together by mutual respect, shared laughter, and youthful adventures through the streets and parks of Lier. Outside of school, Katrien's days were filled with the simple joys of adolescence. She loved riding her bicycle through familiar streets, sketching in her notebooks, and observing the world around her with the quiet curiosity of someone who noticed the smallest details. Friends often joined her for small excursions, whether stopping at a local bakery for a treat or spending afternoons in the park, immersed in conversations about school, music, and the future. She was ordinary in the sense that she enjoyed the typical pursuits of teenagers. Yet there was a depth to her character, a maturity, a perceptiveness, that made her stand out even among her peers. Hobbies and personal interests played a significant role in Katrien's life. She had a fascination with drawing and writing, often capturing observations, stories and sketches in a small notebook she carried with her. These creative outlets were her way of expressing herself, reflecting her inner thoughts, dreams and reflections on the world. She also enjoyed reading, exploring fiction and factual stories alike, which further shaped her curious and intelligent personality. Katrien's relationships with friends were marked by loyalty and empathy. She listened attentively, offered advice when sought, and had a way of making people feel seen and understood. She would spend hours talking, laughing, and planning small adventures with friends, always carrying a sense of curiosity and energy that was infectious. Teachers and neighbors noticed her sense of responsibility and her willingness to help others, traits that spoke to a young girl with both heart and mind engaged in the world around her. The social environment of Lier itself was a defining part of her life. A small, peaceful town with cobbled streets, parks, and local shops, Lier provided a sense of familiarity and community. Everyone seemed to know one another, and there was a shared understanding of neighborhood routines and rhythms. For Katrien, these streets were safe spaces where she had grown up, explored, and created memories. She knew where each corner led, who lived in each house, and which paths were shortcuts or preferred by children on their way home. Her daily routines reinforced this sense of safety and belonging. She would walk to school, often with a friend or two, stopping by familiar spots along the way. After school, she might visit the local shop or spend time in the park before returning home. Weekends were for family activities, small excursions, and moments of creative expression. Life, in its ordinary beauty, was structured, predictable, and comforting, a stark contrast to the abrupt and terrifying disruption that would follow. In retrospect, these details, her friendships, her family ties, her daily routines, became critical for investigators. Each element provided context, each interaction a possible lead. Understanding who Katrien was, how she moved through her world, and what made her tick, helped law enforcement and the public grasp the magnitude of her loss. They also illuminated the life that was stolen from her, the potential she carried, and the innocence of a teenager whose ordinary existence had been cruelly interrupted. Katrien's personality was a combination of intelligence, empathy, and quiet courage. She faced challenges with resilience, approached her studies with curiosity, and nurtured friendships with thoughtfulness. Her character, fully formed despite her young age, was reflected in everything she did. From the care she showed in helping a friend with homework to the way she observed the smallest details in her notebook sketches. She was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in her routines and youthful joys, extraordinary in the depth of her heart and the brightness of her spirit. This background, her family, friends, school, hobbies, and personality provides a window into the life that was abruptly interrupted. By understanding who Katrien was and the world she inhabited, the weight of her disappearance becomes even more profound. The ordinary, predictable life of a 15-year-old girl, full of promise and laughter, had been shattered, leaving a void in her family, her friends, and a community that had known her as a vibrant, intelligent, and kind young person the moment Katrien De Cuyper failed to return home. The ordinary calm of Lier was replaced with an urgent, tense energy. Her parents' initial worry quickly became panic. They checked her usual routes, called friends, and retraced every familiar street. But the absence of even a single clue filled their hearts with dread. The familiar streets of Lier, once symbols of comfort and routine, now seemed shadowed and threatening, holding secrets that no one could yet understand. Police were alerted almost immediately. Officers arrived at the family home to gather preliminary information. They spoke with Katrien's parents, neighbors, teachers, and friends, compiling every detail they could: the time she left school, the route she usually took, anyone she had been seen with, and her typical routines. Each fragment, no matter how small, was carefully noted, for in missing person cases, even the most trivial seeming details could prove crucial. Within hours, organized search efforts were underway. Local law enforcement divided the town into sectors, assigning officers to patrol every street, alley, park, and open area. Volunteers, neighbors, and friends joined in, combing gardens, playgrounds, and wooded patches. Canine units were deployed to trace possible scents along her known routes. Each step of the search was methodical and exhaustive, reflecting both the urgency and the complexity of locating a missing teenager in a town that had never faced such a crisis. Eyewitness accounts formed the first threads of investigation. A shopkeeper remembered seeing a girl matching Katrien's description around mid-afternoon, purchasing a small treat. A man walking his dog reported seeing a fleeting shadow near a park gate. Another neighbor believed he saw a bicycle on a quiet street, but could not be certain it had been Katrien. These observations were fragmented, sometimes contradictory, yet investigators knew that piecing them together could eventually reveal a clearer picture of her final movements. The media quickly became involved, amplifying both awareness and anxiety. Local newspapers printed her photograph with urgent appeals for information. Radio announcements broadcast the news throughout Lier and neighboring towns, urging residents to be vigilant. Television stations ran reports describing her appearance, clothing, and the circumstances of her disappearance. Each public announcement increased the reach of the search, but also highlighted the growing tension within the community. The family's grief and worry intensified with every hour. Each unanswered question, each empty street, each missed clue added to the emotional weight. Friends and classmates, initially bewildered, began organizing their own searches, revisiting familiar parks and streets in the hope of finding some sign of her presence. The town, normally quiet and predictable, became a web of anxious eyes and watchful residents. Police coordination was meticulous. Teams catalogued leads, cross-checked witness statements, and ensured that every tip was followed up. Investigators visited local businesses, interviewed delivery personnel, and monitored public transport routes in search of any indication of her whereabouts. Every effort was made to create a timeline of Katrien's final day, understanding that in cases of sudden disappearance, timing could be the key to solving the mystery. Despite exhaustive efforts, initial leads were frustratingly vague. One sighting placed her near a side street. Another suggested she had passed the park. None could be confirmed. Investigators faced the dual challenge of sorting credible tips from false leads while maintaining the speed and accuracy necessary in the crucial early hours of a missing person investigation. Each decision carried the weight of urgency, knowing that the first 48 hours are often the most critical for locating someone safely. As the search continued through the night, community members took on active roles. Neighborhood groups patrolled streets, checking every corner, alley, and yard. Local shopkeepers kept watch and monitored anyone entering or leaving the area. Friends and classmates volunteered to distribute flyers, ensuring that as many people as possible were aware of Katrien's disappearance. The town's routine had been replaced by a collective vigilance, fueled by fear, hope, and solidarity. Communication and coordination were key. Police set up a central command center to manage tips, coordinate search parties, and record statements. Every officer, volunteer, and community member became part of a structured effort to reconstruct Katrien's last movements. Canines were guided along potential paths, flashlights illuminated dark alleyways, and street-by-street checks were conducted systematically. The town's map became the framework for a massive, highly organized search effort. The emotional toll on Katrien's family was immense. Her parents oscillated between hope that she might still be found and fear of the worst. Friends experienced a similar mix of emotions, grief intertwined with anxiety and determination. The ordinary rhythms of life, dinner, homework, social activities, were suspended as the town collectively focused on finding her. Each passing hour reinforced both the urgency and the uncertainty surrounding the case. By the end of the first 2 days, the investigation had grown significantly. Flyers were distributed widely, media coverage intensified, and volunteers continued to expand search areas. Investigators revisited every tip multiple times, recognizing that memory can be imperfect and that new information may emerge from repeated questioning. Each lead, however minor, was critical in piecing together a timeline of Katrien's disappearance. The disappearance of Katrien De Cuyper had transformed the ordinary town of Lier into a hub of investigation, fear, and hope. Streets she had walked hundreds of times were now carefully monitored. Parks where she had played became sites of intensive searches. Even the smallest details, her interactions with neighbors, her school routines, her favorite paths, were examined with painstaking care. Each step taken by investigators reflected both the gravity of the situation and the determination to find her safe and unharmed. The days following Katrien De Cuyper's disappearance were a blur of anxious searching, endless questioning, and a town gripped by fear and uncertainty. While police worked tirelessly to trace her last known movements, the community became deeply involved, determined to uncover any clue that could lead to her safe return. Flyers plastered on lampposts, public announcements broadcast across local radio, and conversations in homes and cafes revolved entirely around Katrien, her whereabouts, and the fear that something terrible had occurred. Almost immediately, leads began to emerge, some credible, some misleading. Eyewitness accounts offered glimpses of possible activity near the time of her disappearance. A man walking near the park claimed he had seen a girl matching Katrien's description with someone he did not recognize, though he could not provide a clear image of the second figure. Another reported a suspicious van parked along a side street, its driver appearing to watch the area, though there was no direct evidence linking it to her disappearance. Each report, no matter how fragmentary, was investigated with care, but many became dead ends, frustrating both investigators and the anxious community. Rumors, too, began to spread. In small towns like Lier, news travels quickly, and speculation often fills gaps where facts are absent. Some claimed Katrien had run away, though those close to her knew she had no reason to leave home voluntarily. Others whispered about strangers lurking in neighborhoods, unverified reports of suspicious behavior, or unusual visitors near the park she frequented. While many of these rumors were later disproven, they nonetheless added tension to an already anxious town and made the investigation more complex. Local residents became deeply involved in the search. Volunteers organized search parties that combed every possible location, from parks and alleyways to abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. Children, aware of Katrien's absence, asked questions that adults could scarcely answer. Parents monitored their own children closely, fearing that if Katrien could disappear, anyone might be at risk. The collective effort of the community was extraordinary, yet it also reflected the anxiety, suspicion, and grief gripping every household. The police faced significant challenges during this phase. Sorting credible leads from false or misleading reports became an enormous task. Each tip required verification, often through interviews, cross-checking with other accounts, or physically retracing reported movements. Investigators understood that time was critical, but the sheer volume of information, much of it anecdotal, required careful organization. Witnesses occasionally contradicted each other, memories were imprecise, and some statements proved entirely unreliable. Every inconsistency had to be examined, for even a single overlooked detail could hold the key to finding Katrien. One of the most perplexing aspects of the investigation was the lack of any clear pattern or motive. Katrien had been a well-liked, responsible teenager with no known conflicts. She had not shown signs of distress, had no enemies within her social circle, and there was no indication that she had intended to leave town. Theories ranged from accidental disappearance to abduction by a stranger, but each remained speculative. Investigators had to consider all possibilities while relying on the concrete evidence, or lack thereof, that they could collect. Families of other teenagers in Lier became increasingly anxious as well. Parents shared fears, exchanged information, and volunteered in the search, hoping that their involvement might somehow aid Katrien, or prevent a similar fate for someone else. The disappearance heightened awareness of safety, trust, and vigilance within the community. Streets once considered safe now seemed fraught with risk, and the simple act of walking home became a subject of concern and discussion. Media coverage amplified the pressure on the investigation. Reports appeared daily, detailing every confirmed sighting, every tip, and every search effort. National attention brought both resources and scrutiny, yet it also led to the circulation of unverified accounts, which complicated the work of police officers trying to maintain clarity amid chaos. Every day, the story of Katrien De Cuyper was read, discussed, and speculated upon, making it increasingly difficult to separate fact from conjecture in the public eye. Amid the chaos, small breakthroughs occasionally gave hope. An old friend recalled seeing someone following Katrien that afternoon, a detail that prompted police to revisit certain routes. A passerby described a van parked near her usual path, which led investigators to conduct interviews with residents living nearby. Each potential lead was meticulously examined, yet despite hours of investigation, the trail often went cold, leaving frustration and uncertainty in its wake. The community's response was tireless. Local schools held meetings to inform students about the ongoing investigation, encourage vigilance, and provide support to those worried for Katrien's safety. Neighbors created rotating patrols to monitor streets, particularly around areas she frequented. Citizens handed out flyers and contacted authorities with even the smallest observations. The collective effort demonstrated both compassion and fear, a determination to protect the town's youth, while confronting the terrifying reality that a young girl had vanished. Investigators also revisited locations that Katrien frequented, including parks, shops, and friends' homes. Canine units retraced potential paths. Officers conducted door-to-door interviews, and all collected information was compiled into a growing database of observations, sightings, and leads. The methodical approach reflected the urgency of the situation, but even with exhaustive procedures, Katrien remained missing. The first few weeks were a test of patience, endurance, and resilience for both investigators and the community. The absence of Katrien was felt in every home, echoed in every empty street, and weighed on the minds of those who had known her. Friends and classmates struggled to concentrate. Parents watched over their children with newfound vigilance, and the town collectively hoped for any sign that might indicate her safety. Despite the lack of definitive answers, the early weeks established patterns for the long investigation ahead. Leads both credible and false had to be documented and reassessed continually. Community involvement remained high, with volunteers contributing countless hours to search efforts and public awareness campaigns. Media coverage kept the case in public attention, reminding everyone that the search was ongoing and that Katrien had not been forgotten. Weeks turned into months after Katrien De Cuyper's disappearance, and slowly the urgency that had gripped Lier began to shift. The initial flurry of searches, witness interviews, and tips that had filled every moment of police work began to taper off. Leads ran dry, sightings proved inconclusive, and the trail grew colder with each passing day. While the community continued to hope, a grim reality began to take shape. Katrien's case was transitioning from an active investigation to a cold case. The term cold case carried with it a weight of finality, though the investigation never truly stopped. Police kept meticulous records of every detail, from the first eyewitness account to the last unverified tip. Each lead was documented and stored, ready for review if new information surfaced. Yet despite the efforts of law enforcement, the disappearance remained unresolved. The once bustling search parties had dwindled, community patrols became less frequent, and the rhythm of Lier returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the absence of Katrien was a shadow over every street, park, and home. Media attention continued, keeping the story alive in public consciousness. Newspapers published retrospective reports detailing the timeline of her disappearance, recounting early leads and interviewing family members about their ongoing grief. Television programs ran specials on missing persons, often using Katrien's case as a poignant example of how sudden and inexplicable disappearances can impact families and communities. Radio talk shows invited experts to discuss safety, stranger danger, and the investigative process. Public fascination was both a source of hope and a reminder of the case's unresolved nature, ensuring that Katrien's story would not be forgotten. For Katrien's family, the passing of time was agonizing. Every holiday, birthday, and school milestone arrived with a painful absence. Her parents continued to hope for news, however small, and clung to the possibility that their daughter might still be found. Friends of the family visited, shared memories, and offered support, but the emotional toll was relentless. Each day brought a mixture of hope and despair, the uncertainty of her fate an ever-present weight. The lack of closure became its own form of grief, one that gnawed quietly at the edges of their lives. Investigators revisited the early leads, re-examining witness accounts, sightings, and unverified tips. Advances in forensic science, though limited at the time, offered some hope that past evidence could be reanalyzed. Handwriting samples, clothing descriptions, and physical measurements were all catalogued in case they could one day provide clues. Even as the investigation slowed, dedicated officers kept Katrien's disappearance in focus, knowing that the first months were only the beginning of a long journey toward answers. Community awareness remained a critical aspect of keeping the case alive. Local organizations held meetings to discuss safety, raise awareness about missing children, and maintain vigilance in the neighborhood. Flyers and posters, although gradually fading from public spaces, were periodically updated to ensure that Katrien's face remained visible to those who might remember a detail that could help investigators. Schools incorporated discussions on safety and vigilance, reflecting the lasting impact Katrien's disappearance had on the town's collective consciousness. The public fascination with Katrien's case also led to broader discussions about missing children in Belgium and Europe. Experts in criminal psychology, forensic investigation, and law enforcement were consulted to provide insight into the patterns of abduction, runaway scenarios, and stranger encounters. Comparisons were drawn with other high-profile disappearances, highlighting both similarities and differences in investigative approaches. The media often emphasized the uniqueness of each case, while reminding audiences that the vulnerability of teenagers in small towns is a universal concern. Despite these efforts, the cold case status brought new challenges. As months and then years passed without resolution, the likelihood of finding Katrien alive diminished. Leads that had once seemed promising now appeared in retrospect to be dead ends. Investigators had to balance the need for hope with the sobering reality that the passage of time eroded both memory and evidence. Witness recollections faded, physical traces disappeared, and the trail that had been so carefully reconstructed began to blur. The emotional impact on the family, friends, and community was profound. Katrien's absence became a persistent reminder of uncertainty and loss. Every small clue, every fleeting possibility, carried enormous emotional weight. The family maintained hope in private while publicly appealing for information. Media interviews, press conferences, and public statements were all part of the effort to ensure that Katrien's story remained in the collective awareness, that someone, somewhere, might recall a critical detail. Over the years, anniversaries of her disappearance were observed with solemnity. Vigils were held, friends and family shared memories, and the community reflected on the passage of time. These events underscored both the enduring love of her family and the persistent mystery surrounding her disappearance. Katrien De Cuyper had become not only a missing person, but also a symbol of the unresolved anguish faced by families worldwide when a child vanishes without a trace. The cold case status did not mean that hope was abandoned. Rather, it marked a new phase in the investigation, a period of meticulous documentation, careful review of evidence, and constant vigilance for any new information. Police remain prepared to act should new leads arise, understanding that cases once considered cold can sometimes be reignited by a single, previously overlooked clue. Public and media attention continued to play a dual role. On one hand, it sustained awareness and pressure, encouraging potential witnesses to come forward. On the other, it fueled speculation, rumors, and occasional misinformation, which investigators had to carefully sift through. The balance between keeping the case alive in public consciousness and ensuring factual accuracy became an ongoing challenge for both authorities and the family. By the mid-1990s, Katrien's case had become emblematic of missing person investigations in Belgium. It highlighted the vulnerability of teenagers, the critical importance of early response, and the persistent challenges faced by law enforcement when leads failed to materialize. It also demonstrated the resilience of families, communities, and investigators who refused to abandon hope despite the passage of years. Even as the case grew colder, the memory of Katrien De Cuyper remained vivid. Her life, routines, and personality continued to resonate with those who had known her. Friends remembered her laughter, teachers recalled her intelligence, and neighbors reflected on her presence in the streets of Lier. These memories fueled ongoing searches, advocacy for missing children, and a determination to never let her story be forgotten. Years passed, and Katrien De Cuyper's case remained a haunting cold file in the archives of Belgian law enforcement. The small town of Lier had settled into a cautious normalcy, though her disappearance left an invisible mark on every street and household. Friends grew up, neighbors moved on, and her family continued to live with the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. Yet, in 1997, nearly 6 years after Katrien vanished, an extraordinary development would rekindle both hope and anguish in equal measure. It began with a discovery in the woods near the outskirts of Lier. A local hiker, familiar with the dense foliage and winding trails, stumbled upon fragments of human bone, partially hidden beneath leaves and soil. At first, there was uncertainty. Belgium had seen cases of long-forgotten accidents, natural deaths, and misidentified remains before. But the location, coupled with the long-standing disappearance of Katrien, prompted authorities to investigate immediately. Police cordoned off the area, forensic teams arrived, and meticulous collection of evidence began. Every fragment was catalogued, photographed, and carefully handled to preserve potential DNA and other forensic markers. Investigators treated the discovery with cautious optimism, aware that even if the remains were human, confirming identity could take months. The possibility that these remains could belong to Katrien De Cuyper brought a mixture of hope, sorrow, and apprehension to her family, who were notified immediately and arrived at the scene under police supervision. DNA analysis, still in its developing stages at the time, became a crucial tool. Scientists painstakingly extracted genetic material from the skeletal fragments, comparing it to samples obtained from Katrien's parents. The process was slow and meticulous, requiring multiple tests to rule out contamination and ensure accuracy. Every hour of waiting was agonizing, each day stretching the emotions of a family who had already endured years of uncertainty. When confirmation finally came, it was both devastating and relieving. The remains were indeed Katrien's. For the first time, her family and investigators had definitive proof of her fate. The discovery transformed the investigation, shifting it from the search for a missing person to the pursuit of answers about what had happened to her and who had been responsible. Every detail, previously speculative, now took on urgent significance. Forensic analysis offered further insights. Experts examined the bones for signs of trauma, potential cause of death, and any other clues that might indicate the circumstances of her disappearance. While decomposition limited the ability to reconstruct the full sequence of events, subtle indicators suggested foul play rather than accidental death or voluntary disappearance. Investigators catalogued every fracture, mark, and anomaly, hoping that the patterns could point to a suspect or provide insight into the timeline of events leading to her death. The discovery prompted renewed police efforts. Teams revisited witnesses from the initial investigation, cross-checking old accounts with new forensic information. Experts in criminal profiling began to assess possible characteristics of the perpetrator based on the circumstances and patterns of the crime. Geographic profiling was employed to understand where the abduction or murder might have occurred, and investigators collaborated with specialists in cold case management to reanalyze every previously collected piece of evidence. Media coverage surged once more. News of the discovery spread across Belgium and into neighboring countries, reigniting public interest and concern. Interviews with family members, investigators, and community leaders highlighted both the tragedy of Katrien's death and the resilience of those who had sought answers for years. The renewed attention also encouraged members of the public who had previously withheld information to come forward, hoping that even a small recollection could provide new leads. The emotional toll on Katrien's family was immense. While confirmation of her fate brought a painful clarity, it also provided a form of closure. They could finally mourn her in a tangible way, holding memorials, speaking publicly about her life, and advocating for justice. Yet, the knowledge of the circumstances, still shrouded in mystery, left questions that demanded answers. Every day, investigators sought to understand how such a tragedy could have occurred in a community that had once felt so safe. Forensic techniques continued to evolve, offering new possibilities in the late 90s and early 2000s. DNA databases expanded, skeletal analysis methods improved, and investigators gained access to emerging technologies that allowed for more precise reconstructions of timelines and circumstances. Each advancement provided a glimmer of hope that Katrien's case could move beyond the unknown and into the realm of accountability. The discovery of Katrien's remains also prompted renewed psychological profiling. Experts studied patterns common in cases of abduction and murder of young teenagers, analyzing potential motives, behaviors, and likely characteristics of the perpetrator. These profiles, while not definitive, helped guide investigative efforts and focused attention on individuals who might have had opportunity, access, or suspicious behavior around the time of her disappearance. The town of Lier felt the renewed intensity of the investigation. Streets, parks, and neighborhoods became areas of heightened awareness once again. Residents reflected on the passage of time, the fragility of safety, and the persistence of hope in seeking justice. While the community could not undo the tragedy, their vigilance and cooperation with authorities provided support for the ongoing investigative work. Following the discovery of Katrien De Cuyper's remains, investigators faced a dual challenge: analyzing the forensic evidence with the utmost precision and constructing a psychological profile of the perpetrator. The case, dormant for years, had now shifted into a high-stakes investigative phase, combining cutting-edge science with traditional detective work. Every fragment of evidence, every detail from witness statements, and every scrap of memory became invaluable in reconstructing the events that had led to the teenager's disappearance and death. Forensic specialists meticulously examined Katrien's skeletal remains. They looked for trauma, fracture patterns, and other physical markers that might indicate the cause and sequence of death. The analysis revealed subtle but telling signs that pointed toward foul play rather than accidental death. Though time had obscured many details, the remains provided crucial information, including estimations of the timeline post-disappearance and potential handling of the body. These insights would become the backbone for criminal profiling and investigative leads. Simultaneously, a team of criminal psychologists and profilers began reconstructing the likely characteristics of the perpetrator. They considered the victim's age, habits, social circle, and the location and condition of the remains to generate a profile of a person capable of such a crime. They examined behavioral patterns common in cases of teenage abduction and homicide in Europe during the late 20th century. Questions about motive, whether opportunistic, predatory, or personal were central to shaping the profile. The profiling process suggested a perpetrator who was familiar with the area, patient, and methodical. The fact that Katrien disappeared in a relatively populated town, yet left so few clues, implied a calculated approach. Investigators considered the possibility that the abductor might have observed her routines beforehand, choosing a moment when the streets were quiet yet predictable. Behavioral experts noted that the handling and placement of the remains suggested knowledge of how to avoid immediate detection, reflecting a disturbing combination of patience and premeditation. Investigators revisited every witness account from the initial disappearance, cross-referencing them with the new forensic findings. A sighting near the park, previously considered ambiguous, took on renewed importance. Reports of a suspicious vehicle in proximity to Katrien's usual route were reinvestigated, and any previous inconsistencies in statements were scrutinized in light of the physical evidence. Each detail was reanalyzed, with new questions emerging from the combination of forensic insights and psychological hypotheses. DNA technology, now more advanced than at the time of the initial investigation, was applied to all collected evidence. Although some material had degraded over time, modern techniques allowed for the identification of minute biological traces that might previously have gone undetected. Investigators explored the possibility of cross-referencing DNA with national criminal databases, hoping to link the crime to known offenders or, at least, narrow down potential suspects. Every breakthrough, no matter how small, was approached with caution, knowing the stakes involved in such a high-profile case. Psychological profiling also guided investigative strategy. Experts suggested patterns in the likely perpetrator's behavior, including probable familiarity with Lier's geography, understanding of local routines, and possible behavioral tendencies that might emerge in interactions with law enforcement or the community. The profile included age range, gender likelihood, social familiarity, and even potential occupational characteristics, helping narrow the scope of investigative focus. One significant aspect of profiling involved understanding the perpetrator's motives. Investigators explored whether the crime was primarily opportunistic, predatory, or personal. The victim's profile, a well-known, well-liked teenager, suggested the possibility of targeted selection, yet no direct links or personal grievances had emerged. This ambiguity complicated the investigation, requiring a multifaceted approach that combined forensic science, behavioral analysis, and traditional detective work. The community of Lier, still haunted by the original disappearance, watched the renewed investigation with cautious attention. Local residents, aware that the case had moved into a more forensic and psychological phase, provided additional tips and recollections, sometimes recalling small details that had been overlooked years earlier. The passage of time had allowed reflection, and memories previously dismissed or forgotten resurfaced, contributing to a more comprehensive understanding of events. Police re-examined previous suspects in light of the new psychological profile. Individuals who had been questioned in the early 1990s were reviewed against updated behavioral and forensic evidence. Investigators looked for patterns in previous criminal activity, potential opportunity, and proximity to the victim at the time of her disappearance. Though no arrests were immediately made, these reassessments were critical in narrowing investigative focus and refining strategies for gathering actionable evidence. Media coverage during this phase highlighted both the advances in forensic science and the complexity of criminal profiling. Public interest surged again, with news reports explaining how modern techniques could shed new light on cases long thought unsolvable. Interviews with psychologists and investigators helped audiences understand that solving such crimes requires a combination of patience, science, and meticulous analysis. No single breakthrough alone is sufficient. For Katrien's family, this period was emotionally complex. The confirmation of her death was devastating, yet the application of advanced forensic and psychological methods provided a sense of renewed purpose. They could finally see a structured path toward understanding what had happened and possibly identifying those responsible. Hope was tempered with grief, as every step forward also meant confronting the full reality of their daughter's fate. By the end of this investigative phase, Part 7 had established a framework for potential breakthroughs. The combination of advanced forensic science, DNA analysis, and detailed psychological profiling created new avenues for investigation that had not existed during the early 1990s. It demonstrated the evolving nature of criminal investigations and emphasized the critical importance of revisiting cold cases with modern technology and methodology, with forensic analysis and psychological profiling providing renewed focus. Investigators began to explore possible suspects in Katrien De Cuyper's case. Yet, after years of uncertainty, this task proved both delicate and complex. The passage of time had blurred memories, while the community's persistent attention added pressure to ensure that every investigative step was thorough and precise. Each potential lead was approached with caution, as law enforcement sought to balance thoroughness with fairness in a case that had already devastated a family and captivated a town. Early suspect lists were reviewed in light of the new forensic and behavioral insights. Individuals who had been present in Lier at the time of Katrien's disappearance were examined for potential motives, proximity to the victim, and alignment with the psychological profile. Investigators revisited records, questioned acquaintances, and explored patterns of behavior that might suggest a link to the crime. The challenge lay in distinguishing between circumstantial coincidence and actionable evidence, a task made more difficult by the years that had passed. Several theories emerged regarding the circumstances of Katrien's disappearance. One theory suggested an opportunistic abduction by someone passing through the area, exploiting the temporary isolation of the victim. Another posited a local perpetrator, someone familiar with Lier and Katrien's routines, whose actions were calculated to avoid detection. Investigators considered both possibilities, understanding that each theory demanded a distinct approach in terms of evidence collection, suspect interrogation, and community outreach. Despite these theories, evidence linking a specific individual to the crime remained elusive. Witness recollections were often inconsistent or faded with time. Physical evidence, while preserved meticulously, offered limited direct connections to a suspect. Investigators relied on triangulating multiple sources, forensic clues from the remains, patterns derived from the psychological profile, and corroborative accounts from neighbors, friends, and acquaintances. The goal was to find convergence points, moments where independent pieces of evidence intersected to indicate a potential suspect or scenario. Community involvement continued to play a critical role. Citizens were encouraged to provide any information they might have recalled, no matter how minor. Some came forward with previously unreported sightings or odd interactions around the time of Katrien's disappearance. Others shared stories of unusual behavior from neighbors or acquaintances during the early 1990s. Each account, carefully vetted, became a thread in the growing tapestry of investigation, reflecting both the challenges and the potential breakthroughs inherent in cold cases. Investigative challenges were compounded by the limitations of technology and resources at the time. Early DNA analysis, while groundbreaking, had its constraints. CCTV and electronic monitoring were virtually non-existent in Lier during the 1990s, leaving gaps in the timeline that could only be addressed through witness accounts and physical evidence. The lack of immediate leads, combined with the natural decay of memory and physical traces, created an environment where investigators had to rely on meticulous, methodical approaches rather than rapid breakthroughs. Despite these obstacles, authorities pursued every viable lead. Forensic experts continued to reanalyze evidence with updated techniques, seeking previously undetectable clues. Investigators examined behavioral patterns among known offenders in Belgium, cross-referencing timelines, locations, and modus operandi. Each step was intended to narrow the field of possible suspects, build potential cases, and identify anyone whose behavior or presence might link them to Katrien's disappearance. Media coverage during this phase served both as a tool and a complication. Reports highlighted ongoing investigative efforts, keeping public awareness alive and encouraging potential witnesses to come forward. At the same time, speculation, rumors, and sensationalized accounts risked clouding perceptions and introducing misinformation. Law enforcement worked carefully to manage public communication, balancing transparency with the need to protect the integrity of the investigation. Family involvement remained central. Katrien's parents continued to engage with investigators, provide personal insights, and participate in media outreach to maintain public attention on the case. Friends and community members also remained vigilant, revisiting memories, providing information, and supporting law enforcement efforts. Their engagement underscored the human dimension of the investigation. Beyond forensic evidence and psychological profiling lay a network of people whose lives had been indelibly marked by Katrien's disappearance. Throughout this phase, investigators maintained a delicate equilibrium. They had to follow leads rigorously, re-examine past assumptions, and pursue emerging theories without prematurely assigning blame. The complexity of cold cases demanded patience, precision, and perseverance, as each investigative avenue required thorough validation. The goal was clear: to move beyond speculation, identify the perpetrator, and provide justice for Katrien and her family.